struggles when I asked for an additional week of reading and thinking. A number of people came to me with what seemed to be concern. What is going on with you and your reading of Genesis 2 that you need another week? And so it was nothing crazy. I wasn't calling into question an orthodox understanding of Genesis 2. It wasn't that I was doubting whether this is true. It was, as you will see, there's maybe more than what first meets the eye in Genesis 2. And so I will point out a number of things that Genesis 2 teaches us as we see God's image now in Eden, the original dwelling place for God to dwell with man. You may remember, have seen in Genesis chapter 1 that man and woman is the king and queen of creation. God made everything from nothing, and then he crowned creation with his image bearer and gave all things to be under them. Thus, God made mankind king over all creation. We could then call it this: what is creation to man? His kingdom. God, in that sense, we have seen, has a vassal king reigning over the kingdom of earth. And that is man and woman, his image bearers. That was the end for which we saw God go through the 6 days of creation. And at the very end of the 6th day, God declared it very good. We then saw that creation week, in one sense, while all the work was finished, God was not finished. Because on the 7th day, God rested from all of the works that he had made. We put this together and we learned that what Genesis 1 teaches us is that God indeed made everything out of nothing. From that which was formless and void, God now has created a very distinct place with definitions and distinctions, and then he has placed within everything that which gives life, and that there is a king, and it is over this kingdom, and God rests in it. This, in one sense, we could say, as we come to Genesis 2, we could say Adam is the king, earth is his kingdom, and God rests in all of it. That was the original condition that Genesis 1, or really Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, it leaves us with. Now, when we turn to verse 4 in Genesis 2, we learn that God has placed Adam, that is the man, prior to the creation of the woman. And God places Adam in the garden, which we will learn is in the east of Eden, which is made by God for him. And it is going to be described in a way that reflects what later on will be described in the tabernacle and then in the temple, as we read about from David in First Chronicles. It becomes, in one sense, the epicenter of Adam's rule that would spread throughout all creation, as indeed he has been given a mission to fill the earth. And so in Genesis 2, we will see this king is also a priest. That this king, indeed, it has a life in a temple-like garden that God has created for him to serve God forever. This first man, Adam, is placed in the garden, and there he has life with God in this temple-like garden given to him if he obeys. But death comes to him, we will learn, if he disobeys. We will eventually get to Genesis 3, which will unfold for us the great apostasy from God and Eden, and we first must learn, what did God do in forming the man and placing the man and providing for the man in Eden, so that we can understand what he lost in sin and thus come to anticipate Christ restores. Genesis 2 gives us all of this. In one sense, it's hard to overestimate the significance not only of Genesis 1, but we might even sort of lay into a greater emphasis of Genesis 2. And so we will go through Genesis 2, unfolding three actions of Yahweh as it pertains to man in Eden. First, we will see God forms the man from the dust. Second, we will see God places the man in Eden. And third, we will see that God provides for the man woman. Now, we're going to have to shorten the third point, because next Sunday we will come in and we will lean into what God provides for the man in Eden and woman, because it has some incredible implications for every age, every culture, every man, every woman, every boy, every girl, and it is especially relevant in the insane age in which we live. And so we'll consider the third point in a little more detail next Sunday. First, I'm going to read starting in verse 4, and I'm going to read all the way through chapter 2. And then we will go back and look at especially verses 4 through 7 to see that God forms the man from the dust. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh God made earth and heaven. Now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet grown, for Yahweh God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Then Yahweh God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and so the man became a living being. And Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden toward the east. There he placed the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground Yahweh God caused to grow every tree that is desirable in appearance and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became four rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that went around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Now the gold of that land is good, and the bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that went around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is Tigris. It is the one that went east of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Then Yahweh God took the man and set him in the garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. And Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it. For in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Then Yahweh God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. And out of the ground Yahweh God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and he brought each to the man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. And the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. And Yahweh God fashioned the rib which he had taken from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This one finally is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, because this one was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." In verses 4 through 7, we will see that indeed God forms the man from the dust. In Genesis 2, we see that there is a more narrow lens in the attention that Moses gives to the creation of man and then the creation of woman, and it is in a certain place. We will find out that, like the creatures that God had made, so God makes man from the dust. But this beginning, with its more narrow focus than Genesis 1, enables us to see that God creates a certain place that is built in a certain way, so that it, in one sense, we could imagine to be the palace of the king of creation. It is called a garden. And here God forms the land to become a garden, but he also forms from the land the man. It's at the beginning here in Genesis that we see that there is a certain undeveloped condition to the earth. Verse 4 tells us that this is the generations of the heavens and the earth. But in verse 5, we see that no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, no plant of the field had yet not grown. Why? For Yahweh God. Now, this word, Yahweh God, we will need to pay attention to. But notice that it is Yahweh God that had not caused it to rain upon the earth. And there was also no man to cultivate the ground. Verse 7 then tells us that Yahweh God formed man of dust from the ground. Here we are able to see that God did something that indeed was very special in the way in which he not only made man out of nothing to bear his image, but the way in which God made man from the ground. The word "the ground" and the word "the man" in Hebrew sound incredibly similar. There's just an on the end of ground that makes it different from the man. There is an indivisible connection that the man has to the ground because God made him of dust from the ground. This will be what, indeed, when the curse comes to man, God will return man to the very place that God made man. It is also necessary for us to see that God then forms the man from the dust with this link that we could never avoid, and that he places the man in a certain kind of place to accomplish his mission. Verse 8 tells us that place. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden toward the east, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. When God creates the man from the earth, God then also creates on the earth the place that he will then place the man to execute his mission. And this enables us to understand, as Moses is telling us the details of God's creation, his formation of man, and placement of man in Eden. God was not finished when he just made man. There was a sequence and an order that God has to bring about the final and fulfilled formation of man. And here we see that the original state of Adam was to be placed in a divinely constructed garden where he would serve God forever. Before we see that God is going to make the suitable helper for the man to accomplish his mission, and before we see that indeed in chapter 3 we will need to see from woman a seed who will destroy God's enemies, what do we first see? We first see that God made the man from the earth, places him in the garden that God planted for the man, and man was made to live in service to God in his presence forever. Do you think that's what you were made for? Do you? Do you think that you, in one sense, as a son or daughter of the man, do you think that God did not make you for this very same purpose? That in one sense, your existence not only is because God made you, but actually it is for what God made you to do. The original setting for man's existence in the Garden of Eden is that he clearly has been fashioned and then placed in a place that God had formed so that we will see man is to live in a kind of priestly service in the garden forever. This has massive, massive implications for how you understand what is the intrinsic significance of man compared to everything else in creation. This also enables you to understand, since this was lost in man's sin, what must God recover for us in the last Adam? But here we are able to see that the original state of Adam was to serve God in the special place created by God, where Adam would serve the Lord forever. Now, Moses uses a very special name for God here in Genesis 2 that we have not yet seen introduced to us. And it starts in verse 4 with the generations of the heaven and earth in the day that Yahweh God, that's the significant phrase, that Yahweh God made earth and heaven. Here in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, we have the highest concentration of the use of Yahweh God in all of the Old Testament. And for those of us on Wednesday night who have been making our way and we have finished the book of Exodus, we know that indeed when Moses asked God, when he is to go to Israel and give Israel the very message that God told him to give Israel and to give to Pharaoh, the command to let God's people go, Moses asked the Lord, well, who am I going to tell them sent me? And it's there to Moses and then later to Israel that Yahweh is his name. The covenant name of God is revealed in the covenant relationship we see Israel entering into at Sinai with Moses, because God has now revealed himself as Yahweh to Moses. The Exodus and the covenant at Sinai are clearly the works of Yahweh to create a people, to call them, and then to put them in a place where he will be their God and they will be his holy nation and a kingdom of priests. Well, where do we first learn about Yahweh God? In Genesis 2. 19 times in these two chapters, Yahweh God is particularly chosen by Moses to be the way in which he is referred to, except when the serpent talks about it. 45 times is this term Yahweh God used in the Old Testament. I don't think that's an accident. I think that indeed the significance of Yahweh Elohim being the way in which Moses is telling us about God forming the man and placing him in the garden that Yahweh Elohim planted is indicating to us, as Israel would have obviously known by reading the book of Moses, and as we, the church, learn by reading the book of Moses. This is the God of Israel. This is the God of Abraham. This is the God of David. This is the God of Jesus. The relationship that Adam has as the man formed by God and placed in the garden which God had planted is the relationship with the covenant God of all of God's redeemed people that we will read about through the rest of Scripture. Yahweh God is significant to understand what this relationship that the man and we will see the woman have with God, though God formed them from the earth and places or plants them in Eden. Moses says that God forms the man. And in that sense, some of you, like Shelley and Linda, you would be able to associate with the very verb in which Moses chooses to craft the picture of what did God do when he took the dust of the ground and he made man. It is the verb that Jeremiah uses to articulate like a potter would take a clay and create the vessel that he desires. So God formed the man of dust from the ground. Now, unlike any pots that I would ever form, this is indeed Yahweh Elohim as the potter, according to the intent of his own design, shaping, if you will, with his own hand, what the man is to be. This is, in one sense, we would say, the forming of a design, according to the intention of God's purpose for the man to have in the garden. And so this forming of the man like a potter forms his vessel is God exercising his divine creative will to design and make Adam according to his intention. And thus we learn about Adam being formed by Yahweh Elohim from the dust. In this way, the fact that he is from the ground, he is like every other creature. And we see later on in Genesis chapter 2 that indeed that is ascribed to the other animals. But that is the only way that man is like the other animals. Because then we are told, what does Yahweh Elohim do to the man after he has formed him from the ground? Verse 7. He breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. And so the man became a living being. It is not the body that indeed makes the man a living being, but rather when God breathes into him what we might call the soul or the spirit. Here we are able to see that in the way we are to understand a body that indeed is in which the spirit of man dwells, it is a house first made that then is filled with the Spirit. In the Old Testament that continues through the New Testament, the idea of a spirit to somehow a spirit of man being devoid from its body is a foreign concept. Sure didn't happen that way when God formed man. He first formed his body and then breathed into him the breath of life. Then man becomes a living being. Living being, I think, is a good way to render it, because if you render it living spirit or living soul, we might think there's a way to attribute a spirit as if it is disembodied. And clearly what Genesis 2 teaches us, there is no disembodied spirit that exists in disconnection from the body, but rather God formed the body and then filled it with the Spirit. The breath of life which God breathed into the nostrils of the man is what theologians would come to say, this is the image of God that has been placed into him. And so it is necessary for each one of you, and boys and girls, you need to look at me and you need to listen to me. The only thing that makes you like the animals is that God formed you from the ground. But the fact that you have a soul, that you have a spirit, means that you are fundamentally not like any creature of the ground. Because you bear God's image, and no other creature in creation bears God's image. You have an intellect, you have a volition, you have an affection in such a way that you were designed to be a worshiper. Your dog, as noble of a beast as it may be, it is not a worshiper. You're never going to wake up and find, you know what your dog did around his food pail? He built a temple, sort of framed it, decorated it, created some music as he sort of walks through it. Your dog will not do that, but you will do that. You will take the things that you love, whatever they may be, and you will put them on your shelf, and you will look at them over and over and over, and you will think something that this thing will reflect something about you. And do you know why you do that? It may be basketball cards or basketball shoes or ballet tap. I don't know what it might be. It could be anything. But do you know why you do that? No one taught you to do that. You were made to be a worshiper. You were made to give glory and honor and praise and adoration to something such that what you adore, you know, reflects you. That's because the breath of life was breathed into Adam by Yahweh Elohim. And you are just like Adam. You are a spirit that has been housed in this glorious body that God crafted from the ground. Now you are of dust, and you will return to the dust, for we will unfortunately find the horror of horrors that man does sin. To the dust he will return. But this is what it means that God formed the man, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And notice that it is only the man who receives this kind of narrative in the book of Genesis. No other creature were we able to see that God directly and personally breathes life into them, because they are not like the man, and the man is not like them. The breath of life is that which God has placed into the man that makes Adam like God. That is to say that he, in one sense, has a reflection of the very image of God in his person, body and soul. Not that God had a body or walked upright, but that which the breath of life, in one sense, animates that divine image born in man that is manifest in his body. We see this to be exclusively the attributes of the man, Adam. And so this is how we sum it up. Adam is formed by God to be a moral creature that exercises his moral capacity using his intellect, his volition, his affections in service to his God. That's what God did when he formed the man. Moses teaches Israel, and the Spirit teaches the church from Genesis 2, that human beings, therefore, were created by Yahweh with care and craft to serve him in the special place that God has appointed. Indeed, later on in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, we will see a reference that God every day in the cool of the day walked with man in the garden. This is the original condition of man. This is in that sense, the original condition of man's body and the place that God had made man to serve him forever. We give attention now, second point, to God placing man in Eden, starting in verse 8. Here we are told that Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden toward the east. Now, I'm going to ask you, and if I had a whiteboard, I would use it, but we reserve those things for Wednesdays. But you may have seen pictures of the tabernacle. You may remember that Moses is given a vision by God of how he is to construct on earth the tabernacle after the pattern in which God had revealed to him. And you might remember that there is a Holy of Holies, which is in one sense the most inner place of the tabernacle. And it's not constructed as if it is in the sort of a square, in the middle of a square, but rather it's actually to the east. It's offset, not centered. And before that tabernacle, which we will eventually get to in Exodus, here in Genesis 2, we are able to see how does God in Eden, how does he set the garden? Not in the center, to the east. So in that sense, the way that Moses is narrating in verse 8, Yahweh God planting a garden in Eden toward the east, the very, in one sense, organizational arrangement of the garden is in the east of Eden, just as the Holy of Holies was in the eastern side of the tabernacle. And what does God then do with the man? Look at verse 8, second clause. Yahweh God places the man whom he had formed. Here we are able to see that just as Yahweh directly breathed into the man that Yahweh had formed, so Yahweh plants the garden and then Yahweh places the man in the garden. And just to hear over and over and over again, Yahweh, 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 the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. We clearly are able to see this is God's doing for a relationship man is to have with God in the place that God made for the man. Here, man is placed in one sense in a, we'll just call it a temple-like section of Eden that is a walled garden. And that's where Yahweh puts the man. Everything we learn in verse 9 is provided by God for the man so that he might flourish and service and life forever here in the garden. Verse 9 tells us that out of the ground Yahweh God caused to grow every tree that is desirable in appearance and good for food. Remember those two phrases. Desirable and good. A perverted one is going to enter in the next chapter. And as Satan can only do, he twists and turns that which God made for good. So we are able to see that in the garden, in the east of Eden, God is the one who made every tree such that it was beautiful to look at and it was good to eat. But in addition to these trees, there are two other trees. The tree of life is also in the midst of the garden, that is to say, the middle, such that when Adam comes to the center of the garden in the east of Eden, there is the tree of life. In that sense, what as the centerpiece of the garden, in that sense, emanates and gives life to everything in the garden, it is this tree. This tree of life is indeed something that God has planted and given for man in the garden in Eden. It will be interesting to see that the lampstand of the tabernacle that is also placed in the center of the Holy of Holies is to be crafted in such a way that it looks like a tree. And so it seems as if there is some kind of pattern or reflection that the garden and the way in which God indeed has planted it, and this particular tree of life that is in the midst of the garden, is reflected again in the tabernacle and then in the temple. And in that sense, we are able to see that Adam is placed in a very, very special place where he will serve God. And God will come and walk there with him. Another tree we are told about in verse 9 is planted in this garden is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, it is really interesting if you just stop for a moment and think about it. This is the perfect world, the perfect man in the perfect place. And yet there is a tree that is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This means that Adam had categories for understanding that there is good and there is evil before there was evil in the world. It was not necessary for transgression to occur for Adam to have the category of good and evil. He had the category because God had placed in the garden this tree such that mere faith in God and learning from God's provision would give him a knowledge of good and evil. In addition to this, we learn in verse 10 there is a river, and the river, we are told, runs out of Eden to water the garden. And from there it divided and became 4 rivers. That's what verse 10 tells us. And 11 through 14 tells us about the division of this one river, which waters the garden and then divides into 4 rivers. Each one of these rivers are then given a name, and they create 4 distinct lands. 2 of these lands we are able to see, they are described. One of them is told to have gold and bdellium and onyx. And Moses later will be able to describe in the construction of the tabernacle that almost everything within the Holy of Holies itself is constructed either out of gold or plated with gold. And the priestly garments that will be worn as one enters into the Holy of Holies as the high priest, it will bear stones of onyx that will represent the 12 tribes of Israel. But here in the Garden of Eden, the land outside of the Garden of Eden is also filled with such things. It's good. We also are able to think, and I know I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but one thing I am confident in, water still does run downhill. And so if this river runs out of Eden to water the garden and then divides into 4 rivers, and that then divides the land into 4 quadrants, where is this garden in relationship to everything else? I think it's uphill, because water, I think, runs downhill, indicating what is Eden. It's a mountain. And here we are able to see that God, in that sense, he has planted a garden in Eden, which is a mountain, and there he has placed the man and breathed into him the breath of life, because there he will serve the Lord forever. Verse 15 tells us, and Yahweh God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. Now, these 2 verbs, cultivate, your translation may say tend, and then the other verb, keep. Moses uses these verbs to refer to what the Levites did when they were, in one sense, awarded for their zeal for the Lord because they slaughtered the wicked in Israel. They are awarded to be the ones who will be the priests serving in the temple and the tabernacle, and then later the temple. And what that description of their priestly service is a tending and keeping. They, as priests, were to tend and to keep the temple. And here we see first, the man is placed by Yahweh God and in the garden for the very same purpose, to cultivate it and keep it. And so I'm not quite sure what kind of gardening the man was to be, but I think we have to understand the kind of cultivating and keeping that the man did in the garden was not the way you might find some of us trying to cultivate and keep our garden. It's actually something more like a priestly service to God. Thus, we are able to see what did God make man for and place him here to do? To serve the Lord. To serve the Lord. Boys and girls, and your mamas and daddies, you single young men, you old men, all you women, you are a son and daughter of Adam, and you were not made to serve yourself or anyone other than God. The original man in the original place that God had designed for him and then set him in there, he made him to serve the Lord. That's what he did in cultivating and keeping the garden. And then we see in verse 16, there is a command of God. That when God places the man in Eden and we see that all that Eden has, we also see that that includes God's command. Now there is one command. And here in verse 16, we see that the one command hinges on obedience. From any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but, verse 17, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. So the singular command of Yahweh God, that's what verse 16 tells us, Yahweh God commanded the man. Said, disobedience will indeed bring death. Obedience is life. This is in one sense, the centerpiece of life in the garden. Now, it's not a surprise to us if you were to take Deuteronomy chapter 30 and you were to start in verse 11 and read about verse 20, you would find a very strange reflection of the same order of Israel in the land. Deuteronomy, is as Moses is giving to the second generation of Israel. They're entering in the land because of Moses' generation's lack of faith and disobedience, therefore, that comes from a lack of faith. And so they will not enter the land. And what does Moses tell the generation that is entering the land? You enter the land and you will be blessed, you will flourish if you obey. And if you do not, you will die. In this way, we are able to see that God clearly has established for the man in the garden that there is, in God's command, life for those who keep it, and there is death for those who disobey. Now, this is the reason, and we'll have to come to a close, and we'll touch in on a lunchtime topic for some of you to talk about. Covenant theology is built off of, in one sense, inferences made from these two verses of God's command. That here, Adam as the federal head of the race, had the opportunity to obey God, and therefore life would be given to all in him, or to disobey God and death would come to all those who have life or are in him, which is the very logic that Paul takes up in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 17. How did death spread to all? Because all sinned. Because of Adam's sin. And how does Christ give life to all? Out of Christ's obedience. And in that sense, this is where covenant theology constructs theological covenants that are called the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. And they see here evidence for those two theological covenants. Now, non-covenant theologians say things like this. Well, we don't see the word covenant here, and we don't see God cutting a covenant like we will read on in the Old Testament God does do when he enters into covenant relationships, and so they will reject that. What I do want us to be able to see from the command of God that he gave to the man that he formed and placed in Eden is such that we do know what is life for Adam contingent upon obedience to the command of God. And why would death surely come? Disobedience to the command of God. Now, the rest of the Bible unfolds for us very, very quickly because it's in chapter 3. Adam does not obey. And then as you fast forward and you see Israel, in one sense, the next son of God, whom God indeed delivers into a new place and gives his command. And to Israel, he says, if you obey, you live. If you disobey, you die. What does Israel do? They disobey and they die. And so forth and so on until we meet the seed of Abraham and the son of David. And he does not disobey, but he does die, only to be raised up and live again. In this way, we, I think, have to wrestle with, I am not sure if I am a covenant theologian or a non-covenantal theologian. And at some level, I'm not arguing for you to be one or the other, but I am wanting us to be able to see that the command of God in verse 16 and 17 made Adam's life in the garden contingent upon obedience to his command. And death comes only because of disobedience. We therefore know if indeed Adam disobeys, and he did, we need one to come and succeed where Adam has failed. And you are not the one to succeed. But Jesus is. And what we will find, God created in the garden and equipped Adam for. And next week we will see even provided for him in woman. Adam lost by disobedience. And God has restored and regained through Jesus's obedience. And that's why you and I, sons and daughters of Adam, can actually today have a certain hope that God is not only taking you to a place that is like this garden in the east of Eden, but is even greater. And later on today, you can read Revelation 21 and 22 that will describe that place. Because where we and Adam have failed, Jesus succeeded. And there is a new heavens and a new earth that he is going to bring when he returns. You are a son and daughter of Adam. You were formed, Adam was formed by God, and you are from Adam. Adam was placed by God in Eden, and you in Christ can be placed in the new and eternal Eden. But you must come to Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. You must come to know eternal life that will reign over the death that your sin in Adam has brought. But because God has done this for us in Jesus, we will see. Indeed, God has restored in Jesus what Adam has lost in sin. Next week, we will turn to the third point, the provision of woman for the man. So make sure all you single people show up. All right. Don't you go get busy and run off next Sunday. All right. It's going to be important. Thanks for your patience and enduring me going overtime tonight. This afternoon. Jesse, if you would close us in the song and benediction.